Thank you, Amy. 12 minutes after 6 o'clock on the early edition on CBC Radio 1. Thanks for being with us this morning. Well, as major forest fires continue to burn right across the country, the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs is urging Ottawa to provide immediate funding and support for overwhelmed volunteer firefighters. Now, the group says these crews are feeling the strain of inadequate equipment and the lack of resources for training. Meanwhile, demands on them to protect remote and rural communities are increasing during what's predicted to be a long and, in some cases, unprecedented wildfire season. And for more on this, we have reached Ken McMullen. Now, he's the president of the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs and a fire chief for the city of Red Deer, Alberta. Good morning to you, Ken.
Good morning, Stephen.
First off, what are some of the main challenges facing volunteer firefighters right now?
Stephen, I think that the main challenge simply is capacity. In this country, in 2016, there was 156,000 firefighters, and that's combination volunteer and career. And in 2022, we're down to 126,000, which is a reduction of 30,000 people. And of that 126, I think it's important for you and your listeners to understand, 90,000 of those are volunteer. And so when you think about the types of events that are happening, we're doing that with 30,000 less people than we would have 4 or 5 years ago.
Wow. And has the situation changed for volunteer firefighters of late? I mean, here in British Columbia, of course, we've seen a few very, very intense fire seasons.
Yeah, and I think that wears on individuals over time. We're asking our volunteers to do so much more now than traditionally a volunteer firefighter may have done 25 years ago. The types of calls that we're attending, the drastic emergencies that we're responding to have changed. And the risk, both physically and mentally, I think are having an impact on whether or not individuals feel that volunteering as a firefighter is their best use of their time outside of their normal business days.
Now, tell me about the kind of support that the volunteer fire services need to continue in their role protecting rural communities.
Yeah, I think that when I use the word a sign of appreciation and acknowledgement, we're referring to some of the asks of the federal government that I'll just quickly run through for you, Stephen. And first of all, we're asking the federal government to consider increasing the tax incentive that is currently available for our volunteers in this country. Currently, they can have up to $3,000 of the monies that they earn on behalf of the duties of a volunteer firefighter is exempt. And we've asked the government to consider increasing that to $10,000 annually. We also talk about special training and equipment. Up until 2013, the government had a program referred to as the Joint Emergency Preparedness Program that allowed fire departments to apply for dollars to increase training and equipment. And when we think about the fires that are happening in our community right now, it has required different training and different equipment than most of us would have on our standard day-to-day fire departments in this country. Mental health, as I've explained, is having an impact on our first responders. And so we need to ensure that there's appropriate training in place for our first responders, not only during the call, but after the call when they go back and recognize what it's been like fighting these fires. And in Alberta, we're on day 36 here, which is a significant, long time. And the last ask is to have the government consider the implementation of a national fire advisor to help with the assistance and coordination of all efforts on events similar to this one.
One of the suggestions from the Canadian Association of Firefighters is the appointment of a national fire advisor. What do you think of that proposal, and how would it work?
Well, we're going to learn from our neighbors, and these roles are very active in other countries. We don't have to look any further than our colleagues in the United States that have the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA. And within FEMA, there is a position called the U.S. Fire Administrator. And that fire administrator is responsible for the coordination of all fire departments in the United States and how do they connect and support the ministries throughout the government. And right now, there's a lack of that. There's no coordination between the divisions of the federal government, and we know and see great value in having a national fire advisor here in Canada.
The call to improve equipment and training for volunteer crews is happening at a time when we've got lots of awareness about firefighting, for better or for worse, right now. In your view, I mean, what could the federal government do to include volunteer firefighters when it's dealing with the wildfire crisis?
Yeah, and when we talk about the re-implementation of that JEP program, it allowed fire departments the opportunity to purchase training and equipment outside of the normal training and equipment that we need. The day-to-day calls that are relied upon on our volunteer system, we have equipment for fire trucks, we have equipment for motor vehicle collisions, we have equipment for attending medical events. And the bread and butter of emergency response for volunteers is not typically wildland firefighting. Yet we are seeing more applications where our firefighters are doing more in the wildland firefighting arena. And so we need that money to ensure that the dollars are available for training and equipment in that particular circumstance.
Ken, we've seen changes in weather patterns over the past few years. We get very, very hot, record-breaking temperatures 2 years ago here in British Columbia, but we see this heat hitting, right across the country. Certainly Alberta's felt it as well. We see weather patterns changing. We see the wildfire season starting earlier, drier conditions throughout the year. Do we have to start thinking about things differently now, do you think?
Well, I think that we have to look at statistic and data is showing us that we are seeing an increase of climate or weather-related emergencies. And in fact, there are over 2 million responses for 911 calls in this country.
Wow.
And I think two things that are startling. Of that 2 million, over 50% of our calls are medical-related. And that in itself is a staggering statistic. But to your question, we've seen an increase of about 7% of calls are to weather-related events, floods, fires, heat domes. And so looking at the statistics, looking at the data, we do have to prepare differently for weather-related events because they're happening and they're happening more frequent.
Ken, really good to hear you this morning. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you for your time, your interest. All the best and safety to you and your listeners.
And to you and yours. Thank you. Ken McMullen, president of the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, and he's also the fire chief for the city of Red Deer, Alberta.